planty people, welcome back to my channel. I'm Empress and today I am finally doing my succulent leaf propagation video, and I'm also going to be doing a little bit about succulent stem propagating as well. Now I know I've been teasing this video for a while, but I'm finally here and I'm finally doing it. So first, let's pop a few timestamps on the screen. So these timestamps are going to be what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm going to be splitting this video into two sections. So section 1 is going to be all about leaf propagating, and section 2 is going to be all about stem propagating. And then I'm going to slap the two together and you can kind of focus on whichever you want to learn about. So if you want to know more about leaf propagating, you can focus on that, and if you want to stem propagate, we can focus on that. So, alright, let's jump into it. Here in front of one of my many succulent gardens, I have a few, and I am going to be showing you how to dive into different types of propagating, like I just said. Now, I'm going to be talking about today only dry propagating. Now, you may have seen a few methods online that involve water with either cling film or plastic bottles, and you put the leaves in and do all this sort of stuff. And I have personally had some success with that. However, I've had a lot less success and less healthy plants long term. So for me, I stick purely with dry propagating because I've had much better success over my last few years of trial and error with the dry propagating methods than I have with the wet. And I'm just putting that down to it's what the plant is naturally meant to do. They're not naturally meant to be propagated in water. They're succulents. Succulents and water, you know, they are foreign to each other. Stem propagating, I've had a lot more luck with water propagating, and I will do that a lot more often than I will do dry propagating for stems. However, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but mostly this is going to be a video about dry propagating and how to do your propagating with leaves and soil trays versus water bottles or any of that sort of fandangled sort of stuff. We're going to get old school and basic with it. So yeah. Alright, so let's jump into part 1, leaf propagation. Alright, so first section first, I'm going to show you the best way to take a leaf off your mama plant and the best way to get a successful leaf cutting, except without the cutting. I'm going to go to a few different varieties I have here and show you how I personally take off my leaves for propagating. Now, what I do is I will go up to some of the older leaves on the stem, so I won't go for the fresh stem leaves up the top here. And so what you just literally want to do is just give it a little bit of a wiggle, and you want to break it off there. So what I've done there is I've taken it off with the leaf still as one whole piece. It has not broken anywhere, and you can see it's disconnected really cleanly from the stem there. So I'm just going to do another one. Now the older leaves, there you go, are just going to break off a lot easier than the young baby leaves. The young baby leaves are more likely to snap or tear, which is going to get you a lot less success in the long run. Now if you have bigger, fleshier ones like this, can be a little bit harder, so you really want to wiggle. And see, that one has actually snapped. So that is not a clean break on the end there, that is a snap. Now I'm going to throw that in the tray anyway and hope for the best, but I'm a lot less likely to get a plant out of that. So really, really, really gentle. Alright. And that one has come off half torn and half with a piece of stem. So that is going to be less likely to successfully propagate. Let's try one more time. Very gentle. Very, very gentle. Aha, so that's snapped again. So some are just going to do that. Some are just going to snap on you. Now I'm going to try and attempt to propagate these, but I'm most likely not going to have a lot of success. So let's try a different species, shall we? So this one's already growing a baby under here, which is really cute. So that's come off. See, this is what you want. A whole perfect end like that, not raw and snapped off like the other one was. And there we go. So it's got another whole end on it. It's not torn. With that other one over there before, this one, some are going to come off really difficult, and then some, like jelly beans, if you've ever handled a jelly bean, you'll know that, like, you brush up against it and they will just break off on your fingertips. So jelly beans, if you're a first-time leaf propagator, jelly beans are a really great one to do because they break off so easily and so cleanly. So I'll show you with some other jelly beans here. See? So I've got pink jelly beans, blue jelly beans, and I think these are red jelly beans. See? So they just come off so easily. And then you've got these beautiful clean nubbins on the end that have broken off perfectly cleanly. The larger, sort of bulkier ones, you want to go for these sort of base leaves under here. Don't want to go for the top leaves again because they're too fresh. See, that snapped clean in half. It was coming off, I felt it, and then it just like gave way at the last second. There we go. So that one's got a clean end on it. There. And these ones here. Another, yep, see, snap. If you're too rough with them, they will snap. And you're gonna have a lot less chance. See, clean break. Some are definitely easier to break off than others. The more dense your succulent is, like this black prince here, the less success you're going to end up with than some that are easier and more spread apart. Just how good this stem is. To show you one last time, I think you've pretty much got the idea now. See, these, some of them just fall off on their own, and that would have propagated by itself under there and just grown a baby by itself. But some of them really do just come off so easily, and then some of them don't. It really depends on the species and the growth pattern and how rough you are. Okay, so you've got your leaves, which I had added a few extras here just so I had more to lay out on the tray instead of just the few I collected while I was filming. So I grabbed a couple of extras, some of my lavender spoons and a few others. So now we're going to move on to the next part, which is setting up your tray and what soil to use. So really, you can kind of use almost anything you want. It's really super flexible. That's the great thing about them. I use a lot of my rubbish soil for this, so soil that's come out of pot plants that I've purchased, that's, you know, not the best quality, that I wouldn't put in my normal plants that I end up throwing in the garden. You can also use straight succulent mix, you can use cocoa mixes, you can use heavy perlite mixes. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. Personally, I like to do a little mix of kind of, now I'm going to do as my preference. Like I said, I have used trash soil for this before, but I'm going to use a, excuse my head, right in the middle of the frame there. So I'm going to use some of my rubbish soil. So I have a whole big bucket down here that is all of the soil that I kind of pull out of things when it's trash. Because never throw anything away. Reuse everything. I also put it in my garden when my garden needs a top up and things like that. So you really don't need much in here. I'm going to put in a little bit of perlite. I'm going to put in, so this is cocoa core peat, whatever you call it. It's not peat moss, it's the cocoa version. So this is the seed raising version personally, so it's a bit chunkier, but that's only because the normal one wasn't available at my local hardware store. So you really don't need that much in there. Like, it's not even very deep. It does not need to be deep at all. And then you lay your leaves out. So now there are a few ways you can do this. I have, in times when I've not had any tray room, I have just thrown leaves in a container and then gone back to them in a week or so, and when they're starting to do something, I take them out and put them in a tray. But that's a pretty lazy way to do it, and I am not going to teach you how to do that. I'm going to teach you how to do this the proper way. And so now I'm going to pop you on a time lapse, and you can watch me lay out the leaves in a beautiful, nice, neat order, as what I would recommend for somebody who's learning how to do this. And then, you know, when you get really experienced and lazy, you can throw them in a pot and sort through them and do things like that. But for now, let's get the basics down, and so let's jump into a time lapse on laying the leaves out in here. Okay, before I jump into the time lapse, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how I'm going to be laying them out. Now, like I said, there are lazy options, but if you want to be doing it the best you can, this is how I recommend for the best results. So you want to be laying the leaves top to tail. And the reason you want to be doing that is because the new baby plant is going to grow out the end of your leaf tip here. Now, how that happens is there's still, so hopefully the camera is going to catch it. I don't know how well it's going to catch it. But on the end of each leaf tip, there is still a little bit of stem DNA within that end. And your new baby plant is going to be growing using that stem DNA, which is why those broken leaves that I had before don't always work. Nearly often will just shrivel up and die. Occasionally you'll get roots coming through just because succulents are amazingly resiliently cool, awesome plants. However, the reason that they work better when you have gotten them clean off the mama stem with that stem DNA still intact is because that's where the new plant's going to be growing. So when you're laying them down, I prefer to lay them top to tail like you would, like, you know, sleeping in old bunks in school. When you had sleepovers with friends and you'd sleep top to tail, because I don't know what difference that makes except that you get people's dirty toenails in your face, which is kind of gross. Anyway, I've gone off topic. So what you want to do is you want to lay them out with the room for, so this mama leaf is going to die off and your new baby plant's going to grow out from the end here. So what you want to do is you want to leave enough room for that plant to grow in its own little zone, and it will grow in its own little zone and its own little zone and so on. So you're going to have more space for more plants to grow without them stacking on top of each other in the long run. Anyway, so you don't want to watch me laying this all out. Like I said, let's jump into some time lapse of me laying a whole big beautiful tray out of pretty babies. I also just want to say there is a right side up. So when you pull the leaf off, the way that it points to the sky, so that is the top, you can see the way that it cupped into the plant, and that is the bottom. The way that it points to the sky is the correct way to place it up. The roots are going to try and grow out from the bottom, and the baby's going to try and grow out from the top. So if you place it upside down or put it deep into soil, you're going to end up with either the tip end it rotting, or the baby not being able to get out. So you do want to lay them the right way up. There is a right way up, there is a top and a back. Just as a little side note before we jump into the time lapse, which is actually going to happen now, I promise. Okay, so here we have the tray finally done and set up. I've put all the ones that broke badly in this bottom corner here so I can keep an eye on them to see if any do end up sprouting. And then the rest of them I've laid out neatly along here with all of their ends pointing in different directions so that when the babies sprout, they have their own space to kind of grow into. So that is laying them out. And now we're going to move on to our next section. We're going to talk about where to put your tray and what sort of lighting and position is going to be best for it. Now, I find you can put it in pretty much anywhere around your yard as long as it gets a decent amount of shade and doesn't get any really extreme direct sunlight for long periods of the day. Now, the reason for this is if they get very hot sunlight, the leaves are just going to melt. They're just going to disintegrate, and you're just going to end up with no baby plants and no baby anything, and you're just going to end up with sad, dead leaves. So you can put it in the front yard, you can put it in the backyard, you can get morning sun, afternoon sun, as long as that sun is shade dappled, well covered. I have mine under a very large tree, so it only gets dappled sunlight. It does not get any sort of harsh direct sunlight at all. And I have it in a little greenhouse here, which is mainly just to stop them from getting direct rain. That is the next thing I'm going to talk about: watering. So you can mist them occasionally if you so choose, or if you live in a very dry climate, but you actually don't need to water them at all. I sometimes like to water them as they get bigger and closer to the transplant stage, but otherwise you basically need to just leave them alone. The mummy leaf, which is the big leaf that I'm going to put here, which is what I'm going to reference as the mama leaf. The mama leaf, it gives all of the moisture and nutrients to the baby leaf, to the baby plant. Now how I'm going to show you that is right here. So this is a tray of babies that is almost ready to be transplanted, and you can see here that the mummy leaf has shriveled up and given all of its water and its nutrients to the baby leaf. So you do not need to be adding extra water, and the only thing that adding a lot of extra moisture is going to do is it's going to lead to rot, and your babies are just going to melt, not from the sun, but from too much wet. So you want to make sure that they're not getting too much moisture, because then they'll just rot. The next thing we're going to talk about is how long does it take? Well, I'm going to be quite frank with you and say straight up, it takes ages. And ages and ages and ages and ages. This is not a quick way to get plants if you so want. If you want a quick way to propagate your succulents, stem cuttings is a much quicker way, which I'm going to talk about in part 2 of this video. But if you want to propagate them and just have fun with it, which for me this is fun, I really enjoy it. I find this is a really relaxing hobby, and I have so many of them just set up that I just let them go and come back and hope for the best. And they usually just all survive. I've rarely had any losses because I just chuck them in and leave them and let them do their thing. And what you're doing is you're just letting nature do what nature does. And so in nature, a succulent would drop its leaf underneath the plant, and the shade from the plant would protect the baby as it grows from underneath, and then it would mature and grow through the canopy of its own mummy plant and then pop up the top. So what you're trying to do is kind of replicate that in your own environment. And I also want to note that you can see here, you don't need fancy trays like I have here to do this in. This is a broken base of another pot. That's a plastic container. That's a takeaway food container. I've used, containers from sausage trays from when family have had barbecues. I've used a whole bunch of different things. So you do not have to use these sort of trays. You can use any sort of tray as long as it has some drainage in the bottom. So that's why I'm using this, because it's cracked and it's got holes in the bottom. But yeah, you want to make sure that it has drainage, but you can use any sort of tray you want. I'm just slipping that side note in here. But yes, so it does take a while. I couldn't tell you how many months these have been here, but yes, it has been months and months. Same with this tray here. This tray here, I think I lost maybe 1 or 2 of the baby mummy leaves or something, but I think of the whole tray, pretty much the entire tray has survived, and they're almost ready to be transplanted. They're
but I would say that they are a good few months old. But also note that I was growing these over winter, so that's also going to make a difference. So I've just popped over to another tray of mine, and again we have some pretty mature babies here. We have some Black Prince babies and a few other types that I honestly wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head. But again, these are quite a few months old and they are almost ready for transplanting now. So you really do have to have patience for this hobby. If you want to grow baby succulents from leaves, you really got to make sure you have the time and the space and the patience to wait a few months for them to get to this sort of stage, because it really is a time-consuming hobby. Next section is, when is it ready to plant? Well, I kind of hinted that in how long does it take, but what you're really looking for is these mummy leaves to shrivel up and drop off. So it kind of reminds me of an umbilical cord. So the mummy leaf kind of acts like an umbilical cord and gives it all the nutrients. See here? This one's dropped off naturally, which means that is when I say it's ready to go in a main garden bed or a pot or whatever you plan to transplant it in, is when these mummy leaves fall off. Don't try and force them off. You can actually tear holes in the baby, so you really want to make sure that these leaves, see, are just falling off on their own. See, just pops off completely on its own. So you really want to make sure that it's happening naturally. You don't want to force it. So that one's not ready, and so on. So you want to make sure that these are falling off naturally. There you go. So what that means is that is now a mature plant. Well, mature. It is a gangly teenager ready to move out of home and off into the big bad world. Here we have some in the big bad world living their best life. So this was a tray I had of babies that was kind of driving me a bit bonkers. It was just taking up too much room, and I just threw the tray in and went, yep, good luck guys, hope for the best. And they've pretty much all come up. So these were all babies that had lost their mummy leaves, and I chucked in the garden. I've put them in with a couple of handfuls of my reject dirt bucket. So they've got some, potting mix vibes in there with a little bit of fertilizer. And then I've watered them with the seaweed tonic, such as sea salt or eco seaweed, whichever you prefer. And they have been growing really well. And then here we have a few more. So these were also leaf cutting babies that have been put in the garden and done really, really well and taken off quite happily. Ooh, they're a bit thirsty and sad looking. Okay, look at that one. That one's doing beautifully. And those ones are doing beautifully. Yeah, so this is what they look like once they're in the garden. And then in about a month or so, they'll be much larger and they'll be on their way to being big, full, beautiful, happy plants. So this is probably 6 months worth of work at least. But do take note that that was over winter. So winter growing is slower and does take longer for, plants like most succulents, which are summer growers. Of course, you do have some succulents that are winter dormant, etc. Winter growers and summer dormant, but most succulents are spring summer growers. Okay, so that's our section. That's our section on leaf propagating done. So now we're going to move into part 2, and part 2 is stem propagating. So I'm going to get some sharp scissors and we're going to cut some bad boys. So of course the first thing that I have to say straight off the bat is you can only take stem cuttings from succulents that will allow it, basically. So what I mean by that is if you're looking at ones like this or like this, there's no stems to cut. There's nothing to cut, there's nothing to stem, so you cannot take stem cuttings from ones like this. However, ones like this that have a baby growing from the side, or ones like these that do grow up in quite tall stems, they are perfectly fine to get in there and do some chopping. So like with most cuttings, these are clean, they're just rusty. You want to take some clean, sharp tools and you want to snip with as much of a stem as you possibly can. So there, I have now got a couple of leaves to propagate as well, but what I've done is I've taken a stem with a bit of a stick. Now, if you can't do that and you're looking at something, say like one of these, what you want to do is try and take it from as low as possible, and then I'm going to try and do this one-handed. You want to try and strip off the bottom leaves, which you can then add to your propagating pile, and then you want to get a stem. So then you have a proper stem cutting with a little bit of a stem. You could even go a couple more if you wanted to. Yeah. So now you've got your cuttings. So these are your 2 stem cuttings like that. So the next step is leaving them to dry.
Leaving your cuttings to dry, I find, is a very important step. Now, not everyone necessarily agrees with that or does that, but personally, I will not plant a stem cutting that hasn't been dried out. So I like to leave them for 3 to 5 days. I have had them dry out for 7 days once when I was ordering cuttings via the mail, and it got stuck in the post and took ages to get to me, and they were still perfectly fine. So these are super fresh, as you can see, and so they still have a fresh wound on the end of that stem. What drying them out does is it creates a scab or a callus on the end. Now what that does is it means when you plant your stem cutting, it will then, because it's got the callus on the end, it's a lot less likely to rot in the pot. So if you put it in raw, the raw end is still wet and juicy, and if you put it in the pot, it's going to absorb any moisture in your soil, and then that wet and juicy end is going to just turn to mush. Like, it won't happen to everyone, but it's very likely, and it can happen, and it's highly probable, and it is much more likely to happen if you don't let your cuttings dry out. So just be patient, leave them for a couple of days. I know it's hard, but plants, if anything, have taught me patience. I was a very impatient person before my plants, and now I have become a much more patient person thanks to my plants. Now you can also dip these ends in a rooting powder or a rooting hormone if you so choose. Of course, it's not necessary, it's just something you can do for fun if you want. I do like to use rooting hormone occasionally, but it's, you know, it's not every single time. The thing about having a stem this long is if I wanted to, I could take off more leaves, and then after my callus has formed, I could water propagate this. So you water propagate it like you would any other cutting, where you put it in, say, like a shot glass or a slim vessel of water, and you put it in bright indirect light, such as a windowsill that gets morning light or no direct light all day. And then in a couple of weeks, you'll end up with roots. And once you have a big kind of healthy root system, you can pop that in a pot ready to go. And if you don't want to do that, then you can just stick that dry end, once that's calloused over, directly in a pot of succulent potting mix, or straight into your garden if you want. Here's a cutting that I did just that. The end had dried out and it had calloused over, and I stuck it in a pot. So if you've watched my soil video, you'll recognize the soil mix in there. If you haven't, check out my soil video. I'll put the description in the comments. So it is a very well draining, chunky cacti mix with lots of perlite and sand and the likes in there. And what that does is it means it has lots of drainage. Now what you do once you put that cutting in the pot is do not water it. So you've let it callus, you've let it dry out, and then once you do that, you put it in the pot and leave it alone. Don't water it for at least 3 to 4 weeks. The moisture in the fat leaves of your succulent will keep it sustained long enough, whereas if you water it sooner, you will have a much higher chance of that cutting rotting. Of course, if you put it in the garden, try to put it in a week or a few days where you don't have rain predicted coming for your area. But if it does happen to rain on your cuttings, don't freak out, don't dig them up, don't panic. If you've let them callus, they should be fine. If you are a bit worried about your garden bed and rotting, leave them to callus for a little bit longer. They'll be fine.
Just don't leave them so long that they start to shrivel up. That's about the only thing. Transplanting. Now, if you plan on transplanting your stem cuttings to another garden bed or another pot afterwards, I'd give them quite a long period of time to adjust before you even think about digging them up and putting them in something else. So these stem cuttings have been in there for quite a while, and I'm just going to leave them in there for a bit longer, probably about 8 months or something, and they're just going to stay in there. So once you put your stem cutting in something, make sure it's where you want them to stay, and make sure that thing has drainage. So if you're doing a decorative pot for a friend or a family for the holiday season or a gift, make sure that thing has drainage in it. Make sure that it is, if it's glass, make sure you put holes in it, or you can put plastic pots in decorative things. So if you have a cute mug and you want to do that, you can put a little plastic pot in the cute mug that fits, and then put your your cuttings in on top, and then it makes sure that there's not going to be any water log in the bottom. Drainage is key with your succulents. If you put your cuttings in something that has no drainage in the bottom, unfortunately they're going to have a 3 to maybe 12-month life cycle at best. If you put them in something with drainage, they're going to live there until they outgrow it. So that's super duper duper important, is making sure you have drainage. That's it. That's my video on how to propagate succulents from leaves and cuttings the dry method without any water. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you've learnt something. Of course, there are going to be people with different opinions than me and are going to do things differently. This is my method, and I hope that maybe it helps you if you're a beginner and you're a little bit stuck on what to do with that little leaf that you are hoping to propagate, or you want to expand your collection, etc, etc. So yeah, I hope this has been helpful. Let me know in the comments if there is something extra that I missed out that you want to know the answer to, or if you enjoyed this video or whatever. And please like and subscribe and do all those things that make YouTube run a little bit better, and algorithms. You know the drill. Anyway, thanks for watching. Keep growing like your plants, and if you want to just see some sort of, close-up footage of some of these trays, then stay tuned and keep watching. And otherwise, have a great day. Bye!